Welcome to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is my third book called The Londo and the Green Queen's Revenge. It's a novel. It's a novel about me coming to terms with the attempted destruction of an Englishman and his Javanese family. But it is a novel. Yes, it's based on experience. It's based on real people and celebrities, but amalgams of real people or caricatures of them. So if you do identify yourself, please forgive me, because it's only intended as a yarn. Professor Darwin's untimely end. Having just got Maddie back, the last thing I wanted to do was leave her, especially to visit Jakarta, not a month after I'd last been there. But once again the water pump broke and Mas Pradipta said that the pipes and water heater needed replacing. So we booked to return to Jakarta once more. Before leaving, Maddie rummaged through my bag, and I was so happy. She really is back to normal and overcome with jealousy once more. She even got jealous as I smiled to myself, musing over it. Mas Pradipta and I left Gunung Kidul relatively cold. So cold that we sometimes wore training tops during the evening. But we arrived in a hot Jakarta, something I'd become unused to. The door was still against the wall, and I grabbed it, putting it next to Muni's entrance. Nobody ever mentioned it again. In fact, Muni smiled at me. But after we left, Mas Pradipta contradicted himself and told me that Andy's wife had put it there and not Muni. Do you know, I couldn't care one bit, and I don't care what any of the neighbours think about me. I will always forgive them, but can never respect them. The amount of ironing piled on every surface is increasing, and as is the general untidiness of the house, which could no longer be described as a home, more a set from the young ones. Mas Pradipta concluded that the pipes and water heater were fine, and that the culprit was the large pump a tradesman had persuaded Maddie to buy, pocketing the inflated price. So it was replaced with one identical to that which it had replaced, and I do hope this will be the end of it. I took some groceries, a small present, and as much cash as I dare to Martin and Davina. Whilst dilated with my act of generosity, they were as low as I'd ever seen them. I've not asked Martin why he's so short of money, and maybe I'm wrong to assume, but I believe that he gave the Indonesian man who's been promising him a project the last of his money in Indonesia. Martin does receive a pension from the UK, but around a quarter is lost in bank charges, whilst Davina receives a small wage from the University of Indonesia. Combined, their income is much as lower class Indonesian families, and much more than I anticipate I will have to live off once I reach their age. But they're unable to cope. Now, I'm not accusing them of leading a lavish lifestyle, but by the same token, they have not really adapted to living on limited income in Indonesia. I do hope that Martin's faith in this Indonesian man is not ill-founded, as over the last 10 years he has taken millions of dollars from them, and his family wrecked their flat which they allowed them to use. The opposition are claiming that under Jokowi the number of foreigners working in Indonesia has increased. But from what? From nearly nothing to 100 more than nearly nothing in the fourth largest country in the world? But of course, it would help Jokowi's electability if he could show that this was untrue. Nevertheless, I keep recalling how negative attitudes towards the West predate Jokowi's first presidential election. Just as I was having doubts about my doubts, Martin began to have doubts of his own, and seems willing to consider foul play by a wide number of acquaintances. As soon as I got on the bus, I received an email from Branwell asking for money, having specifically said that I'd be going to Jakarta and may not be able to transfer any whilst there. I did, however, try many times, but was unable to him. I'd sent him $240 prior to leaving, and he wanted $2,800 for his flat deposit and first month's rental. While this was not really what I agreed, I am in no position to continue paying his rent. I received a message whilst praying that I was to be compassionate towards him, despite my own father having advised me not to. Branwell's abusive emails became more and more regular, even accusing me of being the reason why he left university for a third time. I arrived back in Gudunkeedle on the Tuesday and immediately sent Branwell the money for his deposit and rent. On the Thursday I sent another $220, but heard nothing from them. Indeed, it was nearly a week since I'd heard anything. Then I received an email from Branwell's social worker. He had been admitted to hospital on the Saturday and was stable, but no more information. Apparently he'd smashed his phone, tablet and laptop and was now completely unable to communicate me. Maybe that was his intention. Had he harmed himself? Attempted suicide? I've no idea, but one day I will find out. Maybe. The social worker did say that she knew that I'd sent his deposit and the nurses were going to help him look for accommodation, but that was all. At once I was plunged back into the self-doubt and paranoia. Was my lead poisoning sent so that I could understand what Branwell was going through? I remember being totally stymied by banks, utility companies, Indonesian immigration, and being completely unable to take decisions on what I need to do and to prioritise. You begin to convince yourself that everything you do turns to a disaster and is better to do nothing. So I guess Branwell was so frightened at the prospect of being homeless that he did nothing about it. So frightened about having no money that he spent all he had. So convinced that the government would not give him any money to live on, he asked for none. Here I am stuck in Java and I can only pray for my son. But at least that is reassuring. In fact, during my prayers, I resolved that should I receive a windfall from Rose, then I would use that to provide for Branwell. Of course, simply giving him money isn't working, but should I ever have enough, maybe a trust fund is the answer. In any case, what our poisoning and near-death experience has taught me is that if we have money, then we simply attract criminals and put our lives in danger. Not that money ever made me happy in any way. A $2 t-shirt bought at the market in the desa makes me every bit as happy as when I shopped in Harvey Nichols in Manchester, as does a $2 meal in the Warrong compared to the cafe in Harvey Nichols. But what really makes me happy is seeing Madde well and loving me. The topping on my cake would be to see Branwell the same. Eid al-Adha, or Eid Haji as Indonesians call it, but in rural areas it is nothing like as organised as in Jakarta. So we needed to buy a goat in the desa and walk it up the mountain to the masjid. I immediately offered to go to the desa with Mas Pradipta to buy the goat and walk it back up the mountain, despite never having walked all the way back from the desa to our home. Nevertheless, I'd always wanted my own goat, to put it in a patchy hat and call it Professor Darwen, albeit that my new pet would only be for a few days, as its fate was already sealed for ritual slaughter and its meat distributed to the poor for Kurban, save for a leg which we kept. However, Mas Pradipta felt that the price would be too high if I came again with him, once again shocking me regarding the Indonesian character. Here I was about to provide my obligational charity to the poor, and people would seek to overcharge me as a foreigner. The reasoning would be that all Westerners are richer than Indonesians, so overcharging me was a part of my religious obligations, even though this is blatantly no longer the case. Indeed, this same argument would suggest that Branwell is richer than Abuzrial Bakri, Indonesia's wealthiest pribumi, which is so blatantly untrue. but not to Indonesians. So I gave Mas Pradipta $200 and he and Budde went down to the pasar. As it happened, so the goat was given a lift to Mas Purwa's house, so it was only a short climb up the mountain to the masjid. It would seem that in Indonesia, even goats are not expected to walk. The goat was large and goat-like, not like the cute caramel-coloured goat I had befriended on the neighbour's farm. I had watched this caramel goat from a kid, always talked kindly to it, even as Budde chased it off our garden for eating the beans. But then nor was this goat a monster, like the massive one we'd seen in Jemba. No, Professor Darwin was a goat. What more could I ask for? Well, maybe a petri, but there was no time for a passion parade, and the professor was taken away without a head covering. We all rose early for Eid and went to the masjid at 6:30, where a parustad from outside the desa acted as imam. He wore a white gamis and turban, looking like an Iranian mullah, so different to the congregation in their colourful batik shirts and unmatching but equally colourful sarongs. I anticipated that I'd have to witness the slaughter of Professor Darwin after prayers, as it was when I lived in Saudi Arabia during public executions. But we went straight home. A few hours later, and Mas Pradipta returned with the professor's leg in a plastic bag. I recall eating El Carburita in Nuevo Laredo and being told that it was made from baby goat's leg, and imagined three-legged baby goats on the hillside. I must say I was somewhat relieved not to have witnessed Professor Darwin's untimely end, whilst at the same time suspected that this was part of the hands-on nature of my obligations in Gunung Kidul. My father had been a grocer, and I was quite used to cutting up meat, but it was the actual slaughter I wasn't relishing. I set about cutting the leg into cubes and marinating them in a tandoori sauce for barbecuing the following day. Being Eid, Maddie's third brother and his wife came to visit us, along with Mas Purwa's wife, who were extremely amused by me marinated meat, but even more so that I'd used garam masala, which means problem salt in Bahasa. I guess garam and masala, or masala with a H as it is in Bahasa, come from the same Sanskrit root, but their exact meaning has diverged to produce this comical linguistic misunderstanding. Those of you who have followed all of my episodes will have concluded that everything which could go wrong in me leaving the UK had done so. So when I received a bill from Manchester City Council for 2 months' council tax on a property I no longer owned in a country that I'd not lived in for over 2 years, I wasn't one bit surprised. I logged on to their site to explain that I was no longer there, but like all UK-based sites, their forms check that your mobile number and postcode are valid UK numbers and postcodes, and if not, you are restricted from progressing further. I did, however, find an open text box to let them know. A few weeks later, in the middle of the night, I received an email saying that it was my duty to let them know as soon as possible as I had sold the property, asking for the name of who I sold it to and saying that they would prepare a final bill. I slept little that night, thinking that this would result in another standoff and another bad credit reference. That morning I realised that I should treat this like everything else and change the polarity of the issue. A few days later I received a final bill showing that they owe me money. Now I cannot see me getting it back without more effort than it's worth, nor did I. But honestly, this is exactly how positive thinking works. Maddie was getting better every day, and I could tell that she was becoming bored with the constraints of living in our desa. So bored that she would have read The People's Friend, had any copies been lying around. Nevertheless, it came out of the blue when she announced that she wanted to move back to Jakarta. I was shocked, as only 2 months previously she'd been adamant that she never wanted to ever visit Jakarta again. Only a year ago, such changes to our plans and the resultant cost would have led to an angry outburst from me. Is it the lack of lead toxicity clouding my brain, or has my near-death experience really changed me? I don't know, but I completely understood and accepted what Maddie was saying. I explained that we were going to Bali on a holiday in a month, and then I may go to Vietnam via Jakarta, so Maddie could spend some more time there. But she wanted to be with me, so we agreed to extend our December visit for Widati's graduation. We could see how we got on then, but of course Maddie wanted to be with her daughters. Titi is not yet 18 and soon to start university, whereas Widati is struggling to adapt and needs her mother's quiet pressure to find work, even to get up in the morning. In fact, Widati had called Maddie earlier that day in a buoyant mood. I thought she must have found work, but Maddie explained that a friend had bought her a fat fairy shirt. A fat fairy shirt? Yes, Maddie explained. Like the ones you wear, with the badge. Fat fairy? Yes, you have many. Oh, you mean Fred Perry? Yes, Fletty. Ultimately, we need to sell the house in South Jakarta, and I cannot see that happening without Maddie there organising things. I'm now fine with us moving, but explained that we had to have a buyer for our home first, as the last thing I wanted was to own 3 properties in Indonesia, or to not own, as I'm not allowed to own any land. So I meant having paid for 3 properties in Indonesia. I also explained that whilst Gunung Kidul could be boring, it was healthy, and that we should have considered going for a month every month to avoid getting into a cycle of depression and paranoia that had previously overtaken us. But I must recognise that Maddie is still only 42 and not ready to prepare for death as I am. She needs to go to the salon every so often to make her feel good. The truth is that at 60, neither am I completely ready to lead the simple life. Yes, we need to lead more normal lives again, but to avoid the cycle of despair which overtook us. I sat on our newly finished terrace, drinking Toraja coffee, and played Benny Hill's Spanish Harlem. I don't know why it was so appropriate, but believe me, it was. Maybe a part is that when I left the UK, I gave Branwell a bundle of records to remember me by, including a London demo of Spanish Harlem. I guess his mum has thrown it in the bin, along with any memory of us. There is a rose in Spanish Harlem, a red rose up in Spanish Harlem, with eyes as black as coal, look down in my soul, and starts a fire, and then I lose control. I have to beg your pardon. Jerry Lieber and Phil Spector. Or maybe it coincided with St Chad's in Shrewsbury appointing a new vicar from East Harlem. Since Ahok's deposal, we were again expected to pay council tax, as lower value properties had been exempt. But before piety does not bring up, but as before, piety does not bring our bills to us, as is his job, which was a part of the set of evidence which we believed showed that he, along with Omuni, was plotting to take our house from us. When we visited Jakarta the last time, Mas Pradipta had to remind piety, and he brought it to Widati, giving her only 2 weeks before it was in default. Is this laziness, incompetence, or is there really a conspiracy? Who cares, as long as we're on top of it? Our neighbours will not change, but our perceptions of them and their ability to affect us can. Nevertheless, Maddie had a change of heart after her brother number 3, the sensible, hard-working one, pleaded with her to stay in Gunung Kidul. He explained to her how ill she was and worried he had been, now that he was the main person calming her down, and that when she was at her worst, and that he could not go through with it again. He went on to say that Maddie was no longer a young girl and should accept a simpler life, even if that included a darker skin and some fat, which I know Maddie cannot accept. Praise be to Allah. He cried, saying that if our neighbours could have taken her mind, maybe next time we would not escape Jakarta with her life. Whilst I felt it was safe to return to Jakarta, I cannot say I was happy with his intervention. It would be good if Maddie could join me on my regular visits to see our daughters and to help in organising the painting and ultimate sale of the house. I really do not want to split my time between Jakarta and Gunung Kidul. Indeed, should we sell the house, I would be much happier if we bought a small house in Jogja for Widati and Titi, where we could also stay when shopping for Western groceries. Needless to say, I cannot be completely sure that Maddie shares. Same day as Maddie's announcement, I spoke with a former business partner of Oscar's. He had now left Bangkok and lives in Spain. Shortly after this call, I received another one from an Australian he had introduced me to, who still lives in Thailand. You would be forgiven for seeing this as pure coincidence, but it's not. My mind had moved once again to thinking about business and work, and I am sending out message from my mind that I'm active again, and such things get picked up across the world. The same was true when I met Maddie. I was not consciously aware that I was looking for a wife, and I would not have chosen somebody like Maddie, despite her being perfect for me. But I was sending out messages to the universe, and the universe knew better than I. I remember when working as an academic, and on a few occasions I had a profound thought, or invented a way of doing something, only to find that at the same time others had come upon the same thing. One such intervention was to look at local economies by using commercial databases from published accounts. I don't know how many people started to do this at the same time, but two others went on to establish commercial products based on this. I should add that I was very friendly with both of these individuals, and we even discussed the coincidence, explaining it as the time had come for such an invention. But I now know that this was the connection which exists between the consciousnesses of mankind. Sometimes it's called the law of the 100th monkey. Yes, its time had come. Yes, we were working in the field. But it wasn't coincidence. It was part of a phenomena that we are yet fully to comprehend. This is related to a phenomenon known as the Mandela effect, in which large numbers of people share false memories. Such as in the 1980s, many people recall Nelson Mandela's death. My God, only a few months ago, I would have run a mile from anyone coming out with such unscientific nonsense. But remember, everything is in the mind, and we are what we believe. As for being unscientific, I no longer believe this to be true. It is at the boundaries of science, and whilst the antithesis of Newtonian materialism, such notions have already run their course. Nevertheless, I must avoid being completely overtaken by the game again and maintain an intellectual distance. Mas Pradipta commented that I was putting on weight, not to be taken lightly, as he'd been the first to spot Maddie's muscles and fat. For some reason, my own weight seems to mirror that of my partner's, and seems completely unrelated to my diet or exercise. Nevertheless, when Mas Pradipta mentioned climbing the mountain the next day, I jumped at the opportunity. I had been in our desa for 9 months and never walked past Maddie's old school. True, I walked down to the market and once even walked halfway home, sleeping for most of the rest of the day, but I need more exercise. In fact, I'd planned to walk to the market the previous day, but we needed to buy water and therefore went by taxi. Now, while I still never subscribed to the Dalesman, until I met my former partner, I would walk in the hills almost every other weekend, especially to Ingrid, which Frankie from Lancaster had introduced me to. My former partner slowly destroyed any pleasure in this activity, at first suggesting that we should walk in forests and shorelines, and then not to walk so fast. So the hill walking, which I'd always enjoyed, became a stroll in the country, and then there was no point, and became walking around a shopping mall. The same is true in Indonesia, with the rest of my family not walking, and Widiati, Tidi and Made and myself having such different interests. The lowest common denominator is shopping. But then in Indonesia, in most cities, shopping is the only leisure activity one can access. I did once try to visit Kota Gede in Jogja, the first capital of the Matram Sultanate, but its name comes from it having a historic market on the Javanese day of Legi, and we arrived during Legi to find it impossible to navigate or find somewhere suitable to stop. If one goes to a mall and is unimpressed, one never returns to that mall. But when trying out new activities, one simply gives up on new activities, and this is why shopping is always the default. The next morning, Mas Pradipta arrived early at his sister Yanni's house, and once I had eaten and prayed, we set off. After Made's old school, there was a steep hill which just continued with small areas of flat, but all the inclines very steep indeed. The next desa was even more like the Pennines, with the houses built to reflect the topography clinging onto the slope. I guess there was less arable land, certainly less flat land, but it did not seem so dramatically different to our desa as I had been led to believe. However, none of the locals seemed shocked at us walking, as they all have to walk up steep inclines every day, so unlike the main desa and even our own. The views were spectacular, with the market easily recognisable and views over Gunung Kidul towards Klaten and Solo, whilst Jogja was a little more obscured by more mountains. Nevertheless, about halfway up, I could go no further and asked to go home, agreeing to try again the following week. I'm clearly showing my 60 years, but there is no reason for me not to get fit again. Mas Pradipta did not call for me the following week, so the next day I decided to walk to the market and back. The walk back, whilst demanding, was nothing like as challenging as I had suspected, and only took 1 hour when I had anticipated 2. True, I had to change my shirt as soon as I got home, as the sun had already become hot, but it was actually enjoyable, and I won't bother to get an ojek again. About halfway back, a group of men asked me to share tea with them and presented me with food. I couldn't work out what was happening when it was explained that a woman in the house was giving birth. This explained why the large pots of water were being boiled. They asked me to return that evening for the Slamatan, a very Javanese tradition which has been lost in much of Indonesia, even much of Java. Others may say this is quaint, but I now believe that it is much important, not simply in bonding the community, but in creating a powerful collective consciousness to welcome the newborn and relieve the mother. Maddie dreamt that Lima was cleaning my underpants. I've no idea how to interpret this, and it probably simply reflects that Maddie has indeed recovered and filling her thoughts with irrational jealousy once more. I also encouraged Maddie to call Lima, but Lima didn't answer the call. It is such a shame that this friendship of 15 years has now been ruined by a Dukan, whom Maddie and I now know all to be fraudulent. Although we always did know this, it was just through our powers as observation and intellect had been temporarily snatched from us, and our resultant behaviour came so close to completely destroying us. Poor Lima is still under the influence of these charlatans, and I have to conclude probably always will be. Or was there more to her fear, As Putri, Maddie had said that Limar had spells placed on us. If this were true, it would certainly fuel her fear. Indeed, she probably told her that the spells would return to her from the very Dukan who had placed them for her. Much later, a thought came to me that Limar actually liked Maddie and not I. For some reason it made sense, and it also did to Maddie, despite neither of us having any evidence as to why and retaining some doubts about it. Certainly in the current climate in Indonesia, it would be dangerous for Limar to hold such feelings, let alone to act on them. But if I am correct, then Limar has indeed been to many Dukan to put spells on Maddie, but not to harm Maddie, to make her love Limar. Possibly even the very strong Jaran Goyang spell Pa Ustad from Puja claimed Maddie had been infected with. Indeed, so many of the Dukan and Pa Ustad we visited were partly correct, that the spells were sent by a woman, and others that they were love spells. But Indonesia's complete inability to think of bullays as other than incredibly wealthy and lack of comprehension of lesbianism always tainted their interpretation. This would also explain why a Dukan had told Limar not to see Maddie again, because having fought off the Jaran Goyang spell, it would return to Limar, and it's obvious to all that Limar lacks Maddie's mental strength. It also explains why the Dukan Limar visited kept saying that they wanted to see Maddie. Would it mean that Limar is the third man in the pub in Wrexham? Maybe. You see, for an Indonesian female, Limar does dress very conservatively, possibly even masculine, wearing trousers and flat shoes, and rarely any makeup. Certainly there is a symmetry in this, if it was a punishment sent by Allah for Maddie having stolen so many of those men's hearts in FTs, where she also met Limar. Over a year after writing this, Pardey in Block M claimed that Limar had been a major source of our problems. The following night, I started to see neon flashes in my periphery vision, just like those around a year ago I used to see in our bathroom in South Jakarta. Then I concluded this was a sign of spiritual possession, or possibly heightened spiritual awareness, even psychosis. Now I was level-headed enough to check on the internet and found that it's simply age-related posterior vitreous detachment, PVD, as the vitreous jelly inside the eyeball changes consistently. Nevertheless, later that night I heard from Branwell once more. He had indeed attempted suicide and was now living in a hotel. He'd spent the $2,800 for his apartment deposit and the weekly allowance of $240 on a new laptop to replace the one he'd smashed, and his hotel. I agreed to replace the $2,800, but emphasised that I was no position to replace it once more. He said that he was going to declare himself homeless next week, or just maybe that he is seeking something of a permanent solution to his situation. I am still horrified that he's been allowed to get into this situation, and that his mental health team seem happy to see my life savings so depleted to prop up their underfunding. Horrified because when I was a successful entrepreneur, I paid millions of dollars in tax in the assumption that it provided an assurance against such misfortune. I also donated 10% of my profits to charity, but now there appears to be no charity. So my son's life is resting on a knife edge because we allowed the banks to gamble the world's economy and mortgaged our children's futures when they lost their bets. There has to be a way out of this madness, a madness which we are all complicit in allowing to occur, myself included, when I believed that countries had to pay off their debts. If children were brought into this world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Would not man rather have such sympathy with the coming generations as to spare it the burden of existence, or at any rate not take it upon himself to impose that burden upon it in cold blood? Arthur Schopenhauer, Studies in Pessimism, the Essays. Over a year after these events, Buddha started to dream about Lima. Strange, as there was no love lost between them. This probably explains why Buddha dreamt that Lima was trying to strangle her. But Buddha always dreamt that Lima had become crazy without knowing about my premonition. Years later, we were given an indication that Buddha's dream was. Those of you who have followed my episodes will be aware that everyone in Indonesia now has to register their mobile phone numbers. Since arriving in Indonesia, my phone has been tapped by Indonesian security services, but I guess this is to make their jobs a little easier. However, the registration process has been a total shambles, probably reducing the country's GDP growth by 0.5%. There were further twists to my personal saga. Months after finally registering, my phone stopped working completely, but fortunately I was in Jakarta and able to visit the company's store. They fitted a new SIM card and I was able to give them my new ID, but not my family card, which was in Gunung Kidul, but they didn't seem too concerned. However, a month later, those texts plaguing me for details began again. But now, having both ID and family card, I was able to comply. But I wasn't able to. I received a message that my ID did not match my family card. So a clerical error, whether deliberate or not, by the government in inputting one or other has made me a non-person. Presumably, this is the same problem that many other people are experiencing with phone registrations, schools, etc. Or was it simply incompetence in identifying who had registered who and not, and who not? Like UK service providers, the phone company restricts your access to their customer service. Although unlike the UK, they really want you to visit their store, not call them. But my nearest store is in Jogja and would cost me $40 to visit. Not that that bothered them, until I threatened to change my provider. I suspected foul play, that as a Westerner I'd been singled out for harassment. Bizarre though this seems, all my Western friends in Indonesia are experiencing some sort of problem with administration. But it would seem that this is one more example of cock-up, not conspiracy. True, the software was not designed with foreigners in mind, despite them being of the greatest interest to Indonesia's security. And this is at the root of my problems. But it is largely incompetence and not design. Of course, the incompetence is not helped by the procedures the customer service follow, insisting that every communication is a new case and therefore not checking previous communications and solutions, meaning that every contact is met with contradictory advice. Exactly what happened to me in the UK with credit card providers. In addition, my Bahasa is not good enough to raise an issue. It is good enough to order from a menu in a restaurant, but if the service designers have not considered your inquiry, and when have they, you will have to go off menu and explain the nuances. But then customer service staff English is not good enough to go off menu either, and certainly not to overcome the ridiculous assumptions they all make about foreigners. So ultimately, the system to which customer service operate ensure that we receive customer disservice. As I have argued, such stress and inconvenience ensure that we keep playing the game and wasting unnecessary energy on mere trivia, but trivia that our masters have convinced us is important, even critical to the human race. The whole episode is a microcosm of that I have been highlighting. Firstly, why do we allow ourselves to be monitored in our every movement and conversation? Secondly, if we answer terrorism, can we be sure that the tragic events of recent years were actually masterminded by a man in a cave, possibly on dialysis? 3. Why have we accepted that without access to the internet or a mobile phone, so many of the things we take for granted are unavailable to us, including a myriad of essential government services, which presumably we have already paid for? 4. Why have we accepted government cuts to essential services that are resulting in deaths and suicide of fellow human beings, whilst still paying our taxes for further surveillance and armaments? 5. Why do we allow oligopolistic service providers to dictate to their customers how they can access their service? 6. Why have we accepted customer disservice and abuse in place of courtesy and customer service? 7. Why have we given these same service providers access to our bank accounts and allow them to bully us with thugs if we question their charges? 8. How did we allow humanity to escape to this? And 9. And having accepted all of this, can we really continue to describe ourselves as human? But I need to temper my outrage, not because what I am arguing is untrue, nor because most of us simply accept it. No, I must temper my outrage because it is exactly these feelings which keep us engaged in the game and to escape it. I must recognise my observations, but not allow them to reduce my vibrations by affecting my feelings. In any case, I need to temper such thoughts, perhaps with a George Formby impersonation, although there are times when only the lion and Albert will suffice. He pulled Albert inside the cave with him and swallowed the little lad all. Now Pa had seen this occurrence, and not knowing what to do next, said, "Mother, young lions, Albert." And Mother said, I am vexed." Marriott Edgar. But there is a more optimistic interpretation, which I must move to. This is why I have already committed to changing my vibrations and reality, and this included a reality without such challenges and surveillance. These challenges are only occurring to test my commitment to a new and better reality. You could see it as a safety valve to ensure that we are ready for another reality and can mentally cope with it. Some 55 years after being introduced to the Ramsbottoms, they still have the ability to bring a smile to my face. But the whole episode with the phone brought home the precarious nature of my existence, or at least precarious to those with power over me. Whilst allowed to work, I would need to pay at least $1,500 annually up front to get a permit before looking for a job, and where I live, few jobs pay $1,500 a year. You see, I live halfway up a mountain, in the middle of a mountain range, yes, on the world's most populous island, but many kilometres from anything familiar. I have no car nor motorcycle, and it takes me 2 hours to walk to the post office and back. A ridiculous journey to an Indonesian, and probably to me in the heat of the midday sun. There are few street lights, and whilst tigers are probably an apocryphal, there are the occasional leopards, an abundance of snakes, making walking far at night time somewhat dangerous. My mobile telephone coverage is patchy and rarely strong enough to support the internet, and only businesses in big cities have landlines. Now, we now, from my laptop, have the internet, which is normally good, but not good enough to send emails via Outlook or webmail, and often not good enough for internet banking. But of course, the internet only works when we have electricity, as during the change of seasons, we have to put up with regular power cuts. But the biggest inconvenience from these cuts is that the water pump stops and we're unable to wash. Even this is not so inconvenience. It's only when it occurs prior to you doing something important, like attending an event or going away unwashed and looking every bit like someone from halfway up a mountain. Indeed, one adapts to living somewhat isolated, if never totally accepting it. But there are times when you're expected to do things which people living in a city would not give a second thought to, but here requires major planning and expense. Family card is registered in Jakarta, and whilst it would certainly make my life easier to transfer it to Gunung Kidul, there are two main reasons why I should not. So for every minor administrative issue, I must return to Jakarta, a part of the reason why all administrative problems cost so much to resolve. The first reason is that having secured a Jakarta family card through Marian Prama, it would be foolhardy for Made to give it up, not least as it would make Widati and Titi's employment and living in Jakarta precarious. But secondly, I have been told that if I change from Jakarta, it would mean restarting my immigration process, a process that I've already spent $10,000 on, and a considerable amount of time and anguish, which made me ponder that the cost of securing my residence will be my second most expensive investment in Indonesia, after my properties, which of course I don't actually own. A little after writing this, the tsunami hit Palu in Sulawesi Tengah. Such tragedies are not uncommon in Indonesia, and Palu's remoteness, neither close to Makassar nor Manado, makes relief efforts difficult. But it highlights Indonesia's poor infrastructure, including a lack of warning, as Palu was suffering from a power cut when the tsunami hit, with most people being on the beach for a festival. Like most of us, people in Palu rely on mobile phones for communications, buy their food and drinking water from supermarkets, medicines from chemists, and rely on electricity for almost everything. So when a tragedy like this strikes, it becomes a crisis. Maybe the crisis happened quicker than it would in the West, but it does highlight how vulnerable we all are. Take away our electricity and we're unable to function. But it's not simply our dependence on modern technology. It is the effect this has on us, on our thinking, as we're no longer able to cope with the conditions our ancestors accepted as normal. I should add that this part of Sulawesi has been close to centres of religious intolerance and intercommunal violence. 1 year after the Palu disaster, the construction of temporary housing reached an impasse as bureaucratic hurdles meant that contractors had not been paid. There are few breweries in Indonesia, especially since beer was effectively banned in many parts of the country. So in fairness, the administrators have had limited opportunities to practice organising such events. Later that year, another tsunami hit the Sunda Strait, and I was reminded of how earlier in the year Pakano had said that it would be a very bad year for Indonesia. As always, it was hard to believe the official news surrounding the event. especially given the level of public funding, which never seems to reach its intended target, and treating truth as an abstract concept in Indonesia. It was claimed that the tsunami warning buoys are not working due to a lack of maintenance. Highly believable in Indonesia. It was also claimed that warnings sounded after the tsunami were due to klaxons spontaneously sounding, also due to a lack of maintenance, may be less believable. I leave you, the reader, to piece a story from this information or disinformation. Not fake news was that 3 ambulance workers were arrested for imposing charges on relatives of the deceased to recover their bodies, as even a disaster exposes unbridled greed. Meeting Parkano after the new year, he explained that there would be a large tsunami hitting Jakarta in March or April. He echoed my concerns that this had been brought about by the murderous tribalism which had taken grip in the run-up to the election. He also disclosed his premonitions come to him whilst meditating in the mountains at night. So despite his differences, not least his Catholicism, he really is a part of the Kejawen tradition. When I questioned him about the reasons for the problems, he told me that he'd seen many places of prayer destroyed across all religions, and I already knew. Only a week ago, a Christian grave had been defiled in Kota Gede. Not so significant, except this occurred in tolerant Jogja. Deep down, I know that ultimately all those who have harmed us will be punished. I must take any delight from this, but eventually each action has an equal and opposite reaction, and it'll come to them. Before I met Made, she had a premonition prior to leaving for FTs from near Rorokidal that Widati would have an accident. She asked Widati not to go out, but Widati did, and she had an accident. Maddie listened to all around her and used traditional medicines, which has left Widati with a misshapen legs. They need to be straightened if she is to be trouble-free in later years. But the cost is enormous without us having medical insurance, and really requires Maddie to look after her for some 6 months. Now Maddie is insisting that this needs to be done at one of the most expensive hospitals in Indonesia, which would necessitate us living back in Jakarta. To my mind, it looks impossible. Both the cost and us living in Jakarta for 6 months without incidents. Once again, illustrating the unforeseen casualties of our poisoning. By chance, I have found that most of the symptoms of lead poisoning were also indicative of heart disease, including my pains in the left arm, persistent coughs, night sweats. Then there was me passing out on the flight to Indonesia, having left the UK in such stressful circumstances. I knew that it was related to my heart, but really never thought that the other symptoms were. For some 10 years, I had drunk heavily, smoked, not caring if I lived or died, but now have given both up. But then I had stopped taking Western medications for high blood pressure and heart disease. In Gunung Kidul, I now lead a much simpler life and healthy lifestyle, and whilst should do more exercise, walking up the mountain and to the village will certainly help. Whilst there is plenty of evidence that we have been poisoned with Pahangabaya, the evidence against Uni is less clear, with the exception of the food box I was given at the Mashola. Certainly been up to no good, along with Pahate. But could heart disease be the main reason for my symptoms? Indeed, just because I've been suffering from heart disease, it does not preclude me also suffering from heavy metal poisoning. Indeed, multiple health issues is the most likely explanation for my myriad of symptoms. With this knowledge, I can look at our neighbours differently, and the fear that I was once paralysed by has gone. Given that everything is in the mind, these new thoughts are so important to my future happiness. Indeed, just as not believing that my Duke and brother-in-law had attempted to poison me, I can use this new information to skip realities to one which is much less sinister. This also illustrates just how black magic works and the difference in perceptions between Westerners and Indonesians. There is no question that Omuni and Perte were using black magic against us, even if they did not believe in it themselves, which I feel is unlikely. They were trying on its power to frighten us through suggestion. How it worked, maybe not immediately, but it was their dogged persistence that really played on our minds. We were sent into a complete panic, spending money we could ill afford to, and engaging in risky behaviour to find solutions to this black magic, all the time creating deeper problems for us, accumulating in Paanggabaya poisoning us, all the time creating such stress that our health suffered, which, if I really did have heart disease, was of course extremely dangerous. Now, had I suffered a heart attack, Indonesians would have seen it as evidence that the black magic had worked, whereas Westerners would simply see it as a heart attack. So should I be thanking Paanggabaya for saving me from a heart attack? Well, maybe. Such a paradox that in bringing me and my family close to death, he may actually have saved my life. Certainly, if none of this had happened, I would have not explored anything about black magic, consciousness, etc. I would not have learned about how to control my thoughts and with it my environment. Without this new knowledge, I would be much less well prepared for death when it finally comes, and maybe less prepared for the further challenges I will face in what is left of my life. Just maybe the lesson I am here to learn is forgiveness, and that at last I have learnt that lesson. Yes, in some way I should thank Paanggabaya, and indeed all Indonesians, as it is in Indonesia I eventually learnt the lesson which was so elusive to me in the UK. Actually, the Gnostics believe that in order to access the knowledge that I have tapped into, we will be tested and tested again. Was Paanggabaya aware that I began on my quest for knowledge after first seeing the tattoo of Ganesh on my Duke and brother-in-law's arm? Then all was sent that I should free myself from the world of greed and revenge and begin to access the hidden knowledge. Again, if it is true, I should be thanking Paanggabaya and Indonesia, even if Paanggabaya was unaware of his role in my journey, where his actions suggested it to him, so that I might continue in my journey. Branwell, I so hope that you can read this as I write, for there is hope. Your schizophrenia is a part of this test. You can access this knowledge without restarting your quest on this earth. Well, that concludes this chapter from my book, The Londo and the Green Queen's Revenge, which is my third book in the series. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I'm hoping to add further chapters about every week, and so far I've managed to do this. If you'd like to hear more from me, then please subscribe and hit the bell. That way you get notifications of when a new chapter is released. In addition, I don't seem to be working very well with these algorithms on YouTube, and my videos really aren't being promoted as they should. So if you could also hit the like button and sort of make some comments, I think that will help me to get noticed. I hate to ask you that, but I really do need more viewers. But thank you for this viewing. Thank you so much.